I've always loved stories, character drama, plot, twists and turns, and I've loved taking people on a journey to someplace they didn't know they were going to go, something that ends up shaping them in ways they never expected. And I've been telling stories my whole life, pretty much God's story in one way or another. This is different. This is my story. My name is Bryan Wilkerson, and I'm the senior pastor at Grace Chapel. And this is the story of my life in ministry. I first felt called to ministry as a high schooler. Our youth group started a coffee house, and it was exciting. We had hundreds and hundreds of kids coming. Friends of mine who had never come to church would now come. And I was a part of the leadership team. I was in charge of cleanup. I remember mopping the floor that night at the end of the evening and thinking, man, I would do anything to do this for the rest of my life. To just be part of something where God's at work and people are coming and being changed and experiencing something powerful, transcendent. I wouldn't have used that word in those days, but something exciting was going on. And I said, I'll do this the rest of my life if I can. So this is the kind of upper room in our house, I call it, where I do a lot of my work. One of the main reasons we loved about the house when we bought it was that it had this study up here. So pretty much everything I do at Grace Chapel gets birthed up here. Both prayer, writing, agonizing, tearing my hair out, all those things. I've been up here all hours of the day and night, meeting God and putting things together. Yankee Stadium, picture of the family, Camp of the Woods, little artwork, pictures of buddies, dictionary, which I still actually use sometimes. So it's just where I do my best thinking and my best work. So it is an old road running race from back in New York when I first started doing races. Buddies from college meeting up at Camp of the Woods, scene from the White Mountains in New Hampshire, the Grace Chapel G, you know, all the stuff that means something to me. I had a pretty idyllic suburban American kids background. Happy families, suburb of New York City, good schools, church-going family, wonderful church. So all those good things that I feel super blessed about. From the earliest days, I loved the outdoors, I loved games, I loved sports, I loved adventure, I loved playing in the woods, camping, and I loved church. There's something about church that I just sort of came alive there. And kind of when you get into those teenage years and you're trying to figure out who you are exactly, am I a jock, am I a burnout, am I a hippie, what am I, who am I with? And eventually found my way to, I'm a Jesus person. I follow Jesus. Yes, I grew up in the 60s, born in 56, grew up mainly in the 60s. So I really was kind of coming of age, so to speak, in the late 60s, early 70s. And, you know, Metro New York was kind of at the heart of a lot of political activity. We were super well informed in our school. I had a lot of really smart friends who were aware of what was going on in the world and were very politically active. It was the Vietnam War era, it was civil rights era, it was lettuce boycotts, it was all those sorts of things. And I kind of got caught up in that movement. That sort of became my identity for a while, was that group of folks, kids. Well, when they began drifting into the more sex and drugs aspect of things, that was not my world. And I had this little gang of guys that I kind of ran with from church. Most of them bigger, faster, stronger than me. I was kind of the brains of the outfit. I kind of kept them out of trouble and that sort of thing. But they brought a bit of an edge and adventure to my life, and I kind of rode on their coattails a little bit. I was always shy and self-conscious, and they were none of those things. My hair was as long as my parents would let me grow it. It was a constant fight. So it was probably about to like here. It couldn't completely cover my ears. There had to be a little bit of ear showing. And going to the barber shop was traumatic. I would fight my parents. It was the worst. The interesting thing about that period of time was we really thought we could change the world. This idealism, you know, give peace a chance, make love not war. We really believed we were going to be the generation to change the world, to bring people together and make the world and our country a better place. And I think my discovery of Christ and his call on my life and his vision for the world actually fed into that. And when I felt like, oh, Jesus wants to take the world to these places too, that's really what the Jesus People movement was about. Now we had a champion who could show us the way and actually help us become the people that we wanted to be and make the world we wanted to be. So it was a very idealistic time that I'm really grateful to have grown up in. And interestingly, it was a troubled time. You know, you had hawks and doves in church. We had people who supported the war and people who were very much against the war in our church. But we got along. We hung together. Everyone had strong conversations, but no one quit on each other. We all stuck together during that season. It feels different today. I mean, all the music that was popular, Beatles obviously, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, a lot of the protest music. I was the oldest in my family, so I didn't have any older siblings to kind of follow. So I was a little late to the game on some of those things culturally, but I remember my first stereo and putting the needle down, and but I probably wasn't until into high school till I did that. But loved music, and interestingly, I took these courses in middle and high school that combined music and art. We called it correlated arts, and this teacher brought together music, art, storytelling, and I realized all these years later, that's what we do at church. We bring all that stuff together. I actually sent my old high school art teacher a note thanking, she was this cool woman named Miss Frazier, and we thought she was the coolest. And I sent her a note and said, thanks for introducing me to the correlated arts, which is just what we do.
Did she write you back?
No. Yeah. Sometimes people ask me if I wasn't a pastor, what would I have been? And I would say either a high school English teacher or a filmmaker. I've just always loved storytelling. I remember seeing my first movie as a kid. My parents took me to the drive-in because they didn't want anyone from church to see us. So because you weren't allowed to go to movies. So we went to the drive-in so we could stay in our car. We saw How the West Was Won. And I sat there spellbound as this saga unfolded on the big screen, this sweeping story of how the West was won. And I was mesmerized. I was crying. I was excited. My brother was asleep in the car next to me, my little brother. And I never forget that movie. And it did something to me. And when it was over, I just thought, wow, that was an experience. And so anyway, I love films, took a filmmaking class in high school, and was actually pretty serious about it. One film we made actually became sort of an underground film because the school banned it. The film was called Busted. I played the part of a drug dealer. We called them pushers in those days. I was a pusher, hiding in a dumpster dealing drugs. And I don't remember the whole plot of it, but somehow I got caught and got put before a firing squad. And when they pulled the trigger, all the guys with guns fell over and I was left. So it's kind of a protest, kind of a film, against violence and war. Well, the school banned it because they thought it glorified drugs and all that kind of stuff. So then there was an underground showing of the film Busted that people went to at someone's house. And so I once starred in an underground banned film. Yeah, I think my parents, I think they respected a little bit of my freedom and gave me freedom to think and be different from them. I remember one time we were talking about music and I played for them Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven. And they could not understand why anyone would like that song. And I remember they wanted me to play it for them. So I played it for them and we talked about it and why I liked it. And they didn't try to talk me out of it. They didn't try to say I was wrong or that was a terrible song. They just kind of said, oh, that's interesting. And we moved on. Now, they would draw lines. My father was a one-time pastor, one-time police officer. So he was all about rules. So we definitely didn't step out of line without getting in trouble for it. But intellectually, I had freedom to think. And they respected that, I think. As a kid, two stories. As a kid, a bunch of us once went out into the woods. I was probably middle school. And we started building fires. But boys and fires. And we were crazy. We had gasoline. We had big pipes. We just were building fires for hours. My mother called us. In those days, she went out the back door, Brian, Keith. So she calls us. So we go home, and she says, boys, why do you smell like smoke? I said, smoke? I don't smell smoke. Keith, do you smell smoke? No, I don't smell smoke. Well, anyway, they pretty quickly figured out we were making fires in the woods, and we got in very big trouble for that. My father told me all these horrible stories about how those fires can go into the roots and spread underground, and so the whole forest could be. So I lay awake that whole night, sure the forest was going to burn down, and the cops were going to come find us for starting that fire. So that was one story. Probably a later story. We used to have these reservoirs near us, and you weren't allowed to swim in them. But it was a super hot day. And my buddies always swam in the reservoir. They did it all the time. Climbed the fence, swam. Kids would hang out at the reservoir, make rope swings. No one ever got caught. No one ever got in trouble. I went one time, because it was super hot at Easter. And sure enough, cops came, took me to the police station. My father had to come, bail me out. That was a bad day. That's my father's worst nightmare, and mine. But that was pretty much my rebellious streak right there. I first felt called to ministry as a high schooler. Our youth group started a coffee house, so we had a Christian rock band, and high school kids coming by the hundreds, literally, to hang out on a Friday night and listen to Christian rock music and go down in the basement and eat free food and rap about Jesus. And it was exciting. We had hundreds and hundreds of kids coming. Friends of mine who had come to church would now come. And I was a part of the leadership team. I was in charge of cleanup because that was the only job no one else wanted. So I wanted to be on the leadership team. So I said, I'll be in charge of cleanup. And I remember mopping the floor one night. Kids had thrown up all over the floor. It was crazy. I remember mopping the floor that night at the end of the evening and thinking, man, I would do anything to do this for the rest of my life. To just be part of something where God's at work and people are coming and being changed and experiencing something powerful, transcendent. I wouldn't have used that word in those days, but something exciting was going on. And I said, I'll do this the rest of my life if I can. So, and I had wonderful youth pastors who had invested in me, and I said, I want to be like them. They get to take kids on retreats and go skiing and, lead Bible studies, and if you can get paid to do that, I'll do that. So went off to Wheaton College to learn how to be a youth pastor, majored in Bible and Christian education. Got involved with campus life, which was like a young life thing in local high schools. So that brought me in touch with unchurched kids. These were not churchy kids. These were kids who never went to church. So it opened up my heart to people who were far from God in church, and kind of changed my whole mindset of what church was about. That's where I met Karen in my college years, and came back to my home church in New York and was a youth pastor there for 3 years. Thinking I would do youth ministry the rest of my life, and that the last thing in the world I ever wanted to do was preach. Until my pastor gave me a chance to do it, and it seemed to work. This one here, yeah, that's we're teenagers. Yeah, that's like we were dating. I got my leisure suit and my puka shells. So Karen and I met when I was out of Wheaton College, a student, and we were both involved in a youth ministry together. She didn't go to Wheaton, she lived in town. So I met her through this youth ministry. I was 2 years older than her. So we started dating, but I graduated and came back east to start my job. So we had 2 or 3 years of a long distance relationship, really, which in those days meant letters. A long distance phone call was expensive. So you didn't call each other, you wrote letters. And I got a box of letters in there that we wrote to each other a lot. So even though we were apart, we got to know each other really, really well. And the interesting thing is, one of many, I think my parents probably sent me off to Wheaton College, a Christian college, to meet some nice Christian girl and marry her. Karen was actually from a Catholic home and not part of a evangelical family, but she had a vibrant relationship with Christ, and we met and got married. And my parents were always super supportive of that. But then I moved Karen her first year. So she did college, we got married. She graduated on a Saturday, we got married the next Saturday, got in our car, drove from Chicago to New York via Quebec City for our honeymoon, landed in New York where she didn't know anybody, and moved into a parsonage and spent a year in youth ministry. So this was my home church and my hometown. So I knew everybody, I knew everything, and I had a gigantic youth group of kids who were used to being in my house all hours of the day and night. And suddenly I had a wife. Those kids kept showing up. They wanted to come over for breakfast. They wanted to stop by on their way home from a date at night. And, Karen had not grown up in a church home, in an evangelical church home. So she knew nothing about this life of being at church so many nights a week. And I did not have good boundaries. And I worked way too much. And Karen was teaching school. So she'd be busy all week. And I'd be busy all weekend. With junior high, middle school, and high school kids. So that was a rough first year, and I did not manage my time well and didn't prioritize our relationship enough. So by the time we came to the end of that first year, much as I felt called to a future of ministry, I was not positive we were going to make it in ministry. While I was working at that church as a youth pastor, the senior pastor asked me to preach one night for the closing program, the children's Christmas program, which is a terrible time to preach because everyone's crazy in the room. So I gave a 15-minute talk on the birth of Jesus, and I still have the notes for it, actually. And people liked it. And I'd always thought, that's the last thing in the world I want to do. I was shy and self-conscious and not quick on my feet. I'm not a spontaneous person, so I'm not quick on my feet. But people really liked it and said afterwards, you should do more of that. So then I began thinking, well, maybe I do want to preach someday. So after 3 years of youth ministry, which I did love, but which also burned us out, we went off to Denver Seminary, wanted to get to a new part of the country, go skiing, and they were famous for being a school for preachers, and I wanted to learn to preach. We got to seminary with the sense that we needed to kind of start over. And we were both pretty burned out on ministry. We needed a break. So for the first year, we went to church for about an hour a week, barely. We would get there late, sit in the back, and on the last time we would leave and head for the mountains for the afternoon just to hang out together. I said no to a bunch of youth pastor jobs. That would have been really convenient and right up my alley, but I drove a school bus instead because we just needed to not have a life in ministry for a little while and just love and enjoy each other and the world around us and build a life together. So we went to the mountains a lot and had a nice friendship group. And little by little, now Karen became the most important person in my life. And she knew it and I knew it. And now we were ready to go forward again. I don't think she and I understood that our first year of marriage. So that was a big shift. But I also went to school, to seminary, to learn to preach. I'd grown up with a good preacher, kind of an old school preacher, 3 points, all beginning with P, and start with a story, end with a poem. And he was a good, solid preacher. But at Denver, I think through Haddon Robinson, I learned what I call the big idea approach to preaching. That preaching isn't a list of points. It's one big, compelling idea. And you come at that idea from all kinds of angles, with stories and illustrations and examples and application and exposition of Scripture, but you're always going after this one idea. Through Haddon Robinson, I got a vision for preaching as an experience where you take people on a journey. So you find them where they are, and you take them into the Scripture, and then you relate that Scripture to life, and you tell some stories and give some examples and offer some challenges. And when it's all over, they're like, oh, wait, what time is it? Where have I been for these 30 or 35 minutes? And you've taken them on a journey that hopefully is transformative. Not because the preacher is so clever or gifted, but because the material is so wonderful. The Scripture, the work of the Spirit. And for sure, I bring to it my skills and interests, but I believe something powerful has to happen when you preach, something supernatural. And seeing that happen every Sunday for 40 years is a pretty remarkable thing. But most Sundays, I feel like that has happened by the grace of God. So after seminary, we had this heart to come back east, so we found our way to a small Baptist church on Long Island, just outside New York City, just over the city limits. Little brick building, about 60 people. I had a tiny little office. It was kind of a one-man show. It was just me. There was no staff. A little tiny office. And I remember sitting there the first day going, well, what do I do now? There's no job description. There's no boss telling you what to do. You have to figure it out. So I knew Sunday was coming. I had to have a sermon, so I kind of jumped into that and preaching in those early years was so stressful. Just every week, am I going to have something to say? What am I going to say? How am I going to say it? And, the days would tick by, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and you're not ready. And I remember many, many times pacing the floor of that tiny little office like a tiger in a zoo, in a cage, just pacing, literally tearing my hair. Lord, I got nothing. What am I going to do? What am I going to say? This is going to be a disaster. And I felt that way pretty much every week for about 7 years. I would say it was about year 7 or 8. I began to feel like, all right, I think I'm getting the hang of this. I think I know how I do this. And at least I know God's going to have me ready, one way or another. Some weeks will be better than others, but at least I know I'll have something. But those early years, when you took the preaching load and then the breadth of people's problems, I'd grown up in a pretty stable, happy, healthy life without a lot of trauma or tragedy in my life. And suddenly you encountered people's real problems, death and loss and unemployment and addiction and broken relationships. And I was not equipped to handle all that pain. So the preaching load and then, the people's pain and then being in charge of an organization. There's a budget, there's a building. Someone's got to clean the toilets and set up chairs. So it was a lot. And I have a vivid memory of one day mowing the lawn on a Saturday afternoon, feeling totally anxious and unprepared for my sermon the next day, and thinking to myself, if I just had a mild heart attack right now, that would get me out of a lot of messes. Not anything serious, just enough to say I can't preach tomorrow. That was a very real thought. We fell in love with those people. It was a quirky group of New Yorkers in this little Baptist church, but they were themselves and they let us be ourselves. And what ended up happening was we just grew up together. There were just a few young families about our age, and we basically became grown-ups together and built a church together over the years. And seeing things happen, going from 60 people to 75 people, and then to 95, and then breaking 100 the first time. And then you paint the building, you're like, wow, this place looks pretty good actually. We have a nice church here. And then you're able to actually hire a secretary. And then you're able to start a kids program. And our first VBS, we had 23 kids. And the next one we had 35 or something. And you see it grow. And by the end, we had 200 plus kids in VBS. So seeing God work and change people's lives and people coming to faith in Christ. Karen started a Bible study in our town with a bunch of women who did not go to our church and would never go to our church, but they wanted to study the Bible. And she would have 15 and 20 and 25 women studying the Bible with her and coming to know Christ in a personal way. And so as hard as it was, loving people, really delighting in people, and seeing God work and being loved by those people, it does not get better than that in life. To do something important and real and powerful, seeing God work and lives be changed and bonding your lives with each other, it was a wonderful experience. 4 children. Our daughter Kelly was born our last year of seminary. That was not the plan, but we happily welcomed her into our family. And so we came to New York with a baby, which probably got us the job because we looked like we were 12 years old. But having a baby made us look like we must be grown-ups. So honestly, I think that was the reason we got the job. And Karen, they liked Karen. So, and then all the other 3 boys were born there in New York. Kind of every 3 years, we ended up having 4. So we moved into the parsonage, which was a tiny little Cape Cod house. And the pastor before us had 4 kids. And I remember when we looked at the house, we had Kelly. And I said, there's no way you could raise 4 kids in this house. And sure enough, we raised 4 kids in that house. We lived there 15 years, tiny kitchen, just a couple of bedrooms upstairs with dormers on them. And our next to last year there, the church remodeled the parsonage. We got a half a year in that expanded house. But it was crazy. 4 kids is crazy. We look back now as grandparents. We have our grandkids for a few days, and we say, how in the world did we do 4 kids? Homework, sports, doctors, and jobs. You know, you have a job, and pastoring is crazy hours, and it's weekends, and it's nights. So it was pretty stressful. But I think as our kids would look back, they've always said it was a good life. That even though I worked a lot, I was with them a lot. I had a little bit of flexibility. I could zip home for dinner and go back to a meeting at night. I could scoot out of the office and watch a soccer game and that sort of thing. So I think they felt I was present to them, but it was every weekend. It was every holiday. So my first monologue was actually just an act of sheer desperation. It was my first Christmas. I'd been there 6 months. I was out of ideas. And here was Christmas. Everyone knows the story already. What are you possibly going to say that's fresh about Christmas? So in a desperate attempt to make the story fresh, I had once seen someone do a dramatic monologue, which was not very good, but for some reason I thought, well, maybe I'll try that. I had no acting experience at all. So we borrowed a woman's bathrobe from church. Karen turned it into a costume. I borrowed somebody's sandals. And in those days, I led the whole worship service. So I led the music, I did the prayers, I did the announcements, and during the offering, I slipped down the center aisle to my office. People wondered where in the world I was going. And 2 minutes later, as the music ended, I came walking back down the aisle in that bathrobe with my ankles showing, and the congregation started to giggle. And Karen's sitting in the back thinking, this is a disaster. I'm thinking it's a disaster. And plus, I had to memorize this whole crazy thing. So I got up there and I played the shepherd boy, and just his wonder at what happened there. And I became that shepherd boy. I remember it. I became that shepherd, filled with wonder at the stars and what God had done and the birth of this child. And the congregation loved it, and I got through it. And suddenly it became a tradition. And so I've been doing them ever since. It wasn't until Grace that I started adding the Easter ones.
No acting experience except for Busted.
Except for Busted. Yes, there was that. I played a drug pusher once. So we eventually hit our stride there in that church and had some really great years. We had a building program, we added staff, and had a wonderful reputation in the community. Things were going great. Then I ran into, in like year 14 or so, that dark night experience I've talked about of just real spiritual doubt and despair. And that was a crisis moment of faith, and I literally took 3 months off of ministry because I wasn't sure I could keep going. The year I turned 40, well, I think it was my 14th or 15th year there at the church, I turned 40. Life was going great, ministry was going great, family was going great, and all of a sudden I was like in this spiritual, psychological midlife crisis. I wasn't sure what I believed anymore. I wasn't sure I wanted to be a pastor anymore. And I remember thinking, life has been so good up till this point, it can only get worse from here. That's the dark place I was in. And I'd never been in that place before. I'm a very positive person. So I didn't even know who I was anymore. So I tried to tough it out for a while, kind of preaching my way through it all. I preached on Jonah. I preached on apologetics. I tried to preach my way out, and I couldn't. And that's when I said to the church, I can't stand up with integrity anymore and do this, so I need a break. And they granted it to me. The Lord met me in that season, revived my faith and my call to ministry. So I came back from that year 15 feeling like, all right, we've had 15 great years, let's have 15 more great years. And we started planning a strategic vision for the next 15 years of that church, thinking I'd spend the rest of my life there. And right about that time, this letter came from this church called Grace Chapel, which I'd heard of. I knew of Gordon MacDonald and heard of Grace Chapel, asking me if I would consider being their next senior pastor. And I thought, what in the world? Why are they sending this to me? And besides, I'm committed to my ministry here in New York, and I shoved that letter in a drawer and didn't even answer it. But they sent a couple more letters and then phone calls. Finally, the chairman of the search committee said to me, how can you say no? You haven't even been here yet. Let us fly you up here and buy you lunch. So I said to myself, all right, free trip to Boston, they'll buy me lunch. Yeah, why not? I'll steal some ideas and come back home again. So I came up for lunch. It was a beautiful fall day in New England. I mean, October, the leaves were perfect. We walked around the campus, which was mind-boggling for me from this small church to see this gigantic campus. Had a nice lunch. I liked these people, but I went home and said, thanks, but no thanks. We got a good thing going here. Why in the world would I leave what I love? And that sort of thing. So we said no. Then they reached out again and said, how can you say no? Your wife hasn't even seen it yet. You need to come back with your wife. So we came back for a Thanksgiving weekend with Karen, and then we met the whole search committee and began poking around. It was not a beautiful fall day. It was a horrible, rainy, cold New England day. And once again, we went home and said, no thanks, not interested. I couldn't imagine leaving this church that I loved and these people that I loved. And in part, my fear was, I've built this church. Well, God has used me to build this church. I'm the guy. Surely I'm the guy to lead this church into the future. And little by little, the Lord said, no, Bryan, I'll take it from here. I can handle it. Job well done. And that's when I realized that we really were kind of stuck as a church. And we were kind of almost like an enmeshed family. And breaking through to a new thing was going to be hard to do. So all those things combined, the Lord gave me a sense of release from that ministry. And as Grace Chapel began to describe the kind of person they were looking for, I knew I wasn't that person yet, but I thought I was becoming that kind of pastor and that kind of leader and preacher. And I thought, if they're willing to let me grow into that that feels like the next great adventure. At that point, though, I said no to Grace twice. And so what were my options? And then Grace reached out a third time and said, we were going to move on, but we just thought we'd check with you one more time and see if anything's changed. And I said, well, funny you should call. So then we came up to visit, and then it just tumbled into place. And the pastor they described they wanted was the pastor I was becoming and wanted to be. And we enjoyed each other, and it felt right. It took a little while for Karen to get there as well. She had just gone back into the workforce. We finally had this new kitchen that she could live in, and life was going great. Our kids were happy. So it was a tough decision. But by the time it came around, we felt released and called and made the move to Grace Chapel. And so glad we did. And it ended up being wonderful for that church too. They had a year of transition, brought a new pastor, and that church has done great. It's twice the size as it was when I left. So God had it all under control. I gave the church in New York 3 months. So the end of July, we spent 2 months saying goodbye, which was heartbreaking. We loved those people, and they loved us, and it was heartbreaking. That's why when we came here, I said, I'm never doing this again. I am not leaving a church again until I'm done. Or they kick us out, because that was too hard. So we moved in August, and I had a few weeks to get acclimated and preach my first sermon on what we call Vision Sunday, the Sunday after Labor Day. You give your heart away when you do ministry. You give your heart to people in a community. And I couldn't see giving my heart away again another time after this. So we were going to give everything to Grace for as long as it worked, and figured this would be our last church, however long that lasted. Honestly, I don't think we thought 25 years. I didn't think I would last that long as a pastor, but I figured another 15 for sure. That was the plan. And so I came to Grace in the summer of 2000 and was immediately overwhelmed by the size and complexity of everything. There were 35 staff members. I had 3 back in New York. We would have our meetings at the pizza place. That was our staff meeting. And suddenly there's 30-some people looking at me saying, what's the vision? I had no idea what the vision was. I didn't even know where the bathrooms were, let alone what we were supposed to do next. I didn't know New England. I didn't know Boston. So that was overwhelming. And I had a serious case of what they call the imposter syndrome, where you feel like any day now they're going to find out I have no idea what I'm doing. And I'm going to fail. I came all the way up here, and on this big stage, I'm going to fail in a whole bunch of people. I've wrecked my family's life, left a life in a church that we loved. The kids are mad, and I had some very difficult, tearful moments of sheer panic that first year, that I was going to fail and that we weren't going to make it, and that we had made a terrible mistake. Those are my worst moments. Karen would talk me down off the ledge. She was a wonderful listener and support, and she didn't lose her steadiness. Even when I wavered, she really didn't waver. And she believed in me. She believed that I could do it, and that we would figure it out, and that God would come through, and the kids would adjust. And she was a rock. And about a year and a half in, I'd say 18 months, kind of came to a turning point where the Lord just said, Bryan, that it was on a run. on a run around Fawn Lake. The Lord said, that's enough. It's time to stop whining and get on with it. And that was a real turning point. And we kind of said, all right, here we go, and felt better after that. I didn't know how to preach at that point. I knew how to love people and care for people. I wasn't sure I knew how to lead a big organization and help a church, a historic church with a great past, figure out its next chapter. How was I supposed to do that? And in the end, I realized we would do it together, that the staff and I and the elders and I and the congregation and I would pray and serve and dream and think and take risks and try stuff. And we figured it out over the years and built a building and gave ourselves a campus to work with and planted a church, and then decided the Lord opened up the door for multi-site in 2010. And it just kept changing and growing. And often I would feel like I'm just along for the ride. Other pastors would ask me, how did you get here? And I'd say, I don't know. We just did what we were supposed to do. And the Lord met us and blessed it. So it was a very collaborative kind of a journey. I didn't have a lot of mentors, oddly. The people I'd looked up to in ministry were much older at that point and not so active and not so available anymore. So in a sense, I was kind of on my own. There was one large church pastor, Leith Anderson, who was pastor of a church out in Wooddale, Minnesota, and he knew me a little bit. And when he heard that I had taken this new job at Grace Chapel, and he knew Gordon and knew Grace Chapel's story, he said, we have to have lunch. I was taking a class from him out in the Midwest. He said, let's do lunch. And he looked me in the eye and he said, you're the pastor of a mega church, and you need to start understanding that, and you need to start acting like it. And that was kind of a wake-up call to me, and I had to accept the fact that God had called me to this and trusted me with it, and with his help I could do it. And so Leith became a bit of an advisor to me over the years. To realize that I couldn't do everything. I could not make all the hospital visits. I couldn't speak at every event. I couldn't even visit every event. So I was going to have to be comfortable with the idea that as long as people were being cared for, I was still being a good shepherd. And as long as this group had a good teaching, I was a faithful teacher to them. And that you accomplish your ministry through other people, not by doing it all yourself. I used to think a shepherd meant, you put the lamb over your shoulders and you carry them around. You can't do that when there's 3,000 lambs. So you have to train other people to do that and trust that they can do that. And I realized that shepherds don't just care for individual sheep, they create healthy environments. Environments that are safe, where sheep are well fed, where they're protected and guided and led to the next thing. And that's what it meant to be a shepherd in this setting. And when I understood that, I felt better, because shepherding model's always been important to me as a pastor. You have to let go of control. You have to let go of being the hero. Other people are going to be the hero. They're the ones. You have to trust them. And they may do it differently than you do, and they may do it better than you do, and you can't be threatened by that. I think one thing it means to lead a large church is you need to have strong people around you and not be threatened by them. We've always had strong elders. We've had strong staff members. And I've delighted in that, and they have fueled me, and we've had these wonderful partnerships where I could let them be themselves and they let me be myself, and together God did a beautiful thing. The moments I really love being a pastor, one would be on a Sunday when you're preaching and everyone's dialed in and you sense something happening in the room, that moment between you and the people you're with, that's a great moment. I love being in a lobby on a Sunday when it's filled with people and they're connecting and they're signing up and they're making friends and they're introducing a friend and they're getting prayed for, and they're all ages and ethnicities. I suppose it's like a restaurant owner on a Saturday night. I love a crowded lobby, church lobby, and seeing things happen. I love being in a meeting with a team of people who are dreaming up the next sermon series or Christmas Eve and what we're going to do this year. And for a while it's hard and we're stuck and we can't get our ideas together. Someone says something and then you feed off someone else, and this person's an artist and this person's a musician and this person can do video and this person does sound, and all of a sudden you create something together. Man, that is the best. And then you get to do it on a Christmas Eve. When we, as many as we would do on Christmas Eve, I'd always do another one. It's just, those are favorite moments. When you pastor a large church, a major part of your job is staff life. In a smaller church, there's 2 or 3 of you, each do your jobs, and everything's fine. But suddenly when there's 30 of you, or 40 or 50 or 60 or 70, now you all have to work together and trust each other and build an organization and communication channels, and there's all kinds of ways for that to go haywire. So staff conflict has probably been, we haven't had a lot of it at Grace, but from time to time, and that's always been heart-wrenching, because I love and respect everyone I work with, and when those relationships aren't working, it's super painful. I've had remarkable unity and oneness, mind and spirit with the elders, pretty much all these years, but once or twice we've gotten sideways with each other, and that's hard because, again, you respect each other and love each other, but you're not seeing eye to eye about something. I do remember a moment of fear. It was as we were tearing down those buildings for the first building program. Richard Rhodes and I were standing, literally watching the bulldozer destroy that building. And I'd only been here, a couple of years at that point. I was still the new guy. And I remember Richard and I looking at each other and saying, well, we're in it now. I sure hope this works. Because that's that failing on a big stage kind of thing. If this doesn't work, that's going to be a disaster. So that was a scary moment. And then, COVID was obviously a real soul-searching time. Yeah, I'd been on sabbatical for and I hadn't taken a sabbatical in a long time. I was way overdue. We were away for 1 week, and I got a phone call from Mark, our new executive pastor, who said, at the elders meeting last night, they voted to shut down services on Sunday. I said, what? No way, I'm coming back. I came back to work on Tuesday, 1 week into my sabbatical, and by Wednesday, I realized the elders were absolutely right, and we were shutting down services Sunday, and we wouldn't open them again for 14 months. The first few weeks, it was kind of a novelty and a unique challenge, and we preached our way through it and innovated and adjusted and all that, but when we realized this is now the long haul, and that took a toll on everyone's spirits, on our congregation, our leaders, our staff. It was hard to find joy and energy in those days, and lots of pastors kind of gave up in those days, or kind of came to the end of themselves and their careers in those days. I'm so glad we all stuck it out together, because that became a really formative time for us. I think we're a different, stronger, more innovative church, better suited to the future because of what we learned and how we pivoted during the COVID years. I'm glad they're behind us, but I would not want to live them again. Karen and I just took advantage of the time just to be together. So on my day off, which was Tuesday in those days, we would just get in the car and drive somewhere. That's what everybody did. You took drives, right? You couldn't talk to anybody. You couldn't go to a restaurant, so you just took drives and took walks. So every Tuesday, we would take a drive to Maine or New Hampshire or Rhode Island and see some part of New England we hadn't seen, and we would take a walk. And then we would do Zoom dinners with people, with our family, with friends all over the country. And we would they'd make dinner, we'd sit on the table, we'd set up the camera, and we'd sit for 2 hours and just do Zoom dinners with people. And it was remarkably satisfying. We still do it now, sometimes with friends in other parts of the country we can't see. And we were part of a really great small group, brand new small group that started during COVID. We met twice in person, all new people together. First time together. COVID hit, and we went online, and for the next year and a half, we just met online, and were remarkably consistent and faithful and honest, and we saw each other through those years, I think, as a community. One of the wonderful things about being at Grace has been the global vision and reach of our church. So over the years, we've gotten to travel all over the world, literally, to all kinds of places to see and engage with and learn from the work of the church and God's kingdom all over the world. So I do remember our first trip to Moldova. That was our first trip. And I'd never done international travel. I'd never done speaking with a translator. We landed in the airport. We arrived at the church in the middle of a worship service. They were already underway. They walked me onto the platform, sit me in front of all these people, and 5 minutes later, I had to stand up and preach with a translator, which I'd never done before. Talk about the imposter syndrome. I felt like a phony, like a poser. I just agonized my way through that sermon. The translator helped me out, I'm sure, and it worked out okay. But the wonderful thing about mission travel is that when we go to countries, we don't typically go to resorts. We live in people's apartments. We sleep on their couches. We might live in a guest house. We take the bus. We ride the train. We eat in their homes. So we are in the midst of everyday life for people. So it's been northern India, Cairo, Moldova, Colombia, South Africa, Chad, Beijing. We've gotten to go some really wonderful places and to see the work of God unfold in all these places and meet leaders whose sacrifice and commitment, honestly, I am humbled and sometimes ashamed when I look at the commitment and the boldness and the sacrifice that God's people make in other parts of the world. We have a lot to learn from them. So over the years, the Lord has just opened up doors for me to do other things. So some years ago, I was invited to serve on the board of Denver Seminary, which is where I had gone, and had a wonderful experience. I wanted to help other pastors have that experience, pastors and their spouses have the kind of experience we had. So I felt like that would be a place I could bring my wisdom to an experience to help shape future church leaders, Christian leaders. So I've been on that board for 9 years or so and have enjoyed that. About 10 years ago, the Lord kind of gave us and me a heart for Greater Boston, for the churches around the city. So we began building this network that we eventually called Greater Things for Greater Boston, and just building relationships, primarily cross-culturally across the city, and finding ways to partner together to serve the city. Church-school partnerships, service days in the city, joint worship experiences, things like that. And I loved that. The Sundays off, I would go visit these other churches and just get to know these pastors. So I've enjoyed doing that. And then I get chances sometimes to speak other places. I've been preaching at Camp of the Woods now for 25 years. And that was actually an important preparation for me coming to Grace. I had always only preached to 300 or 400 people who I knew really well. Suddenly at Camp of the Woods, I'm in front of 1,000 people I don't know at all. And so learning how to preach to a large crowd where you didn't know everybody and realizing, oh, I actually can do that. That kind of gave me a new level of confidence when Grace Chapel called that I could step into this environment. And Camp of the Woods has become kind of a second home for our family. So when we made the move from New York to Boston and everything, the kids felt like they lost their moorings. When we went back to Camp of the Woods that summer, it was like, oh yeah, now we know who we are. We're a family. This is our life. We love each other. God's been with us. He'll be with us in the future. So it's been kind of a centering thing for us. So all along, I've always said to myself, I don't want to overstay my welcome at a church. The pastor I grew up with, as wonderful as he was, he overstayed his welcome. He stayed too long, didn't prepare the church for a transition, and the church went into decline, and as you heard me tell the story, never recovered. So I've always said, I won't stay too long. I want to leave the church at a good time and in a good position. So, once you hit 60, you start thinking about that. And also thinking that the church and staff at some point need a younger leader who can connect with younger generations more effectively. So that was always in the back of my mind. The elders and I had a very frank conversation when I turned 60 and said, let's just start talking about this. We're allowed to talk about it, and we're not going to get weird about it. So as years went by, we would revisit it. Then COVID hit. And that could have been either an inflection point to say, maybe I should just get out now. Because there were some rough years there. Not just COVID, some other things happening in culture and in the church. And for a while, I began to wonder if I was actually the right guy to see the church through this season. And maybe I should leave now, and this would be a time to transition to a new leader. But I never really had a peace about leaving the church in an unsettled spot, and felt like I need to see this thing through. And I've shepherded this congregation for 20 years, and with God's help, I want to see them through this as well. So glad I did that. And took a year or two or three to realize we were going to make it out of this, but we did. And now the Lord's gotten us to a wonderful spot. So at a certain point, it was a combination of feeling like Grace Chapel's in a good spot, spiritually, staff morale's good, financially, we're regaining our footing again. But it's also kind of a wet cement time. We're still reimagining church after the pandemic. So this church doesn't need a 2 or 3 year vision from me. They need a 5 and 10 and 20 year vision, and a leader who can see them through that. And a leader who can connect with younger generations who are having a hard time connecting with church right now. That combined with having done this for 40 years and having had a lot of the same conversations 40 times about worship styles or building programs or budget deficits, at a certain point you say, I think I've done this long enough. And wanting to invest in my children and my grandchildren at a time in life when they need it and want it, having the freedom to travel. And I guess I want a new chapter of life. What's it like to not be full-time employed and be able to live a different kind of a life and meet God in new ways? So all those things together felt like this was the right time. And then conveniently, 40 years is a pretty good number. So it's hard to argue with that. That felt truly biblical. So as poignant as the season is, and now there's sadness about a lot, there's also a real sense of peace, both for ourselves and for Grace Chapel. I really do feel like it's in God's hands, and this is the right thing for all of us. There's an old bad joke that says, old ministers never retire, they just go out to pastor. Anyway, I once heard someone say it's not retirement, it's refirement, which is just as hokey. But there's something I like about that it's not so much retirement, it's a new stage, a new chapter of life and ministry. I can't imagine not wanting to communicate God's word creatively to people. I can't imagine not wanting to come alongside people in challenging seasons of life. I can't imagine not wanting to talk shop with church people. So I'll still find ways to do that, but without the same pressure and demand, and with the freedom to lean into family and other things that I've not always been able to lean into. It's wonderful to come to the end and not feel like I can't wait to get out of here. I don't feel that way. I feel ready, but to finish well, I remember saying to the elders at some point, however and whenever we finish, by God's grace, we want it to be a good story. A good story for the church, a good story for us, a good story for God and the gospel. It is going to be an interesting journey for me to not be the senior pastor of something. I don't think I have a gigantic ego, but when you're the senior pastor of something, you're somebody when you walk into a room. And I'm used to walking into a room and everybody knows who I am and they're glad to see me and they want my opinion. So it's going to be a little different to walk into a room than just be a guy. And there's a part of me that will like that, not having expectations of me every time I show up at something. But there's probably another side. They'll say, hey, do I still matter? I always tell Karen, the scariest thing to me about getting old is feeling irrelevant. I don't ever want to be irrelevant. I want to be part of the story. Whatever story is going on, I want to be part of the story. And I understand as you get older, you're going to play different roles in that story. I want to be part of the story one way or another. I still love the church. I still love preaching. I still love helping create environments and experiences where people can encounter God. I still love pastors and church leaders. I don't want to be in charge of something. I don't want to have deadlines and budgets and those things to worry about. So I hope to continue to find ways to preach, supporting churches around New England when they're without a pastor for a week or two or whatever. I'll stay connected to Grace Chapel as pastor emeritus, which we'll still figure that out as Pastor Joshua gets on board, because I want to support him completely and believe in him completely. But if I can be helpful around the edges, if I can do a men's breakfast or visit someone in the hospital or offer some counsel or care or coaching to young leaders, maybe do that sort of thing for Grace Chapel. And then I also hope to find ways to coach pastors in New England and around the country to just share some wisdom and learnings with the next generation of church leaders. Looking back, I wish I could say to myself as a young leader just starting out, relax, be yourself, trust your gut and your instinct. If the Lord has brought you to this place, it's because you're the right person for this place. And the things you've learned, the training you've had, the instincts you have, in God's sovereignty, they're the right ones for where you are. So stop comparing yourself to everybody else. You know, I'm not this pastor, I'm not that pastor, they're a better preacher, they're a better leader. I wish I could just told myself, just stop, relax, be yourself, trust your gut. You will find your voice, you will find your way. God will be faithful. That's what I tell young leaders now. It's interesting. I probably still feel like a New Yorker. Born and bred there, spend over half of my life there. 2/3 of my life I spent there. So that kind of DNA, I suppose, is there. But Boston's been a wonderful environment for us. I've always been an American history buff. So when we bought a house on Paul Revere Road, we said it was meant to be. So we love the historical environment. I love the academic environment. The brilliant people who sit in our congregation every week, and makes me do my homework and be a more thorough, thoughtful, careful teacher and preacher. Here in New England, you have to earn people's respect. We have often used the word, you have to surprise people with the goodness and the beauty of the gospel and the church and scripture, because there's a lot of cynicism. And that challenge of surprising people with the gospel has been a real joy here in New England. So we feel very much at home here and have loved it, and we're sticking around. So I came here to Boston with this chip on my shoulder about being a Yankee fan in Red Sox territory. And in those days, the Yankees were on top of the world. So I had a lot to brag about, and everyone, razzed me about it or whatever, but I was the winner. Well, that completely flipped, and I've been on the losing end now almost since the day I got here. But I've hung on to it because it's just been fun, and it's given us a way to go back and forth. And when people give me a hard time, I say to a Boston fan, if you moved to New York, would you root for the Yankees? And they're like horrified. Well, of course they wouldn't. And I said, well, I would. You got to represent. Yeah, we've gone back fairly often to our church in New York. And the first time or two was pretty painful, because you are reminded of everything you left behind. And I was still finding my way here. And now you go back and everyone loves you, and you feel at home. So that was kind of gut-wrenching in the beginning. But now we love going back. The church has changed a lot. A lot of those folks aren't there anymore. But it's comfortable. They love us. We love them. We can celebrate their successes. I have a good relationship with, they're now on their second successor to me. And so I love going back to old churches. I always go back and visit. I dreamed of doing a marathon back in seminary. When I first started running, the idea was I was going to train for a marathon, and I just was never able to get ready for that. So I put that dream off for years. Ran New York Marathon in, I think, 92, which I don't know how I did that. We had 4 kids, ministry, how I ever trained for that. But that was a remarkable experience. Running New York is like a circus. There's just spectators the whole way. You run through all these ethnic neighborhoods. I remember coming down off the Queensboro Bridge, just about the halfway point, and they're playing Bruce Springsteen, Born to Run. And I'm like chugging down thinking, I am the man. And then you hit mile 20 and you want to die and be carted away on a stretcher, literally. So that was New York in 92, but everyone wants to do Boston. So I got to do Boston in 2014, the year after the bombing, which ended up being a pretty remarkable year to run. There was a lot of a focus on that day. It was very meaningful, and that was a great experience too. Maybe I have one more in me, I hope. When I was in seminary, I didn't want to do ministry work, so I got a job as a bus driver, school bus driver. It was perfect. Early morning, in the afternoon, bus full of kids. And I was a youth pastor, so I was used to kids. They could go crazy back there, and I didn't care. I just kind of tuned it out. The moment they did something bad, I knew, but I could tune out all the other stuff. And really, it was driving that bus that I first began to think while I moved. I remember driving that bus for 2 hours every morning, every afternoon on a very familiar route and turning over in my head papers I was writing or things I was working on. And I think that's when I fell in love with creative thinking while in the process of doing something else. I kind of developed that habit that I now take with me every time I'm on the move, whether I'm on an airplane or running in the woods. One of the scary things about preaching is you have to do it every week. Every week you got to come up with something. And people will often say to me, how do you come up with something to say every week? And my answer is, I go to the Bible. It's so rich. There's so much literature there. There's so many characters there. There's so much mystery and drama and discovery and beauty and tragedy that I have great material to work with. If I didn't have the scriptures and I just had to come up with something to say every week, I'd be lost. I have something to say because of the scripture. Same with the monologues. People say, are you an actor? No, I could never act. The only reason I can do that is because this biblical character's come to life for me and I get to tell that person's story. Take the scripture out and I got nothing. We meet as a team and work things out ahead of time. So I kind of know where I'm going 3 months at a time in terms of texts and topics. But I pretty much write every sermon every week. I start on Monday morning, real early, do my study, my exegetical work and commentaries and things like that. I always work on a yellow legal pad, and I literally just write and scribble ideas and then start taking notes, and it just stacks up on itself, probably 3-4 pages of notes. Tuesday morning, I try to turn into an outline and get a sense of where I'm going, think the whole thing through, and then Tuesday, Wednesday, write. Thursday, record. That doesn't include, when I get writer's block, I exercise. What I typically like to do, spend about 2-3 hours studying, and then go for a run or go to the gym and just turn it all over in my head. And most every good thing I've said, I probably thought of while I was exercising. No, it's terrible to call it done. The only reason it's done because I have a deadline. On Thursday morning, I type until 9:11. I press send and I drive to church to record at 9:30. And Sunday morning, yesterday, I was calling them on the way to church saying, I'm going to drop a section, can you get rid of that slide? So it's really not done till it's done. I would go to church and practice it out loud, standing there. Now I've done it long enough, I can talk it through in my head. But yeah, usually by Sunday morning, I get up super early. It's all written, and I'm just trying to say it out loud to myself in a whisper, probably, chunks at a time. For me, I can't preach until the Lord has met me in the preparation of that sermon. Helped me see something I hadn't seen before, confronted me with something in my own life, connected that truth to a conversation I had earlier in the week, and just year after year, week after week, the Lord meets. To me, every week is an adventure. That's going to be hard to get used to when I'm done preaching every week, because for me, every week, my eyes are open, my ears are attuned. I wonder what I'm going to hear. I wonder what I'll see. I wonder who I'll bump into that's going to shape the sermon I preach next Sunday. And every week, I have moments that it comes together and I feel like the Lord's preparing me to preach. And then when I preach, I spend 20 hours a week getting the sermon ready. Even after all these years, it takes 20 hours. And I try to take the congregation on the journey I've been on and take those 20 hours and compress it into 33 minutes and try to let them have the same aha moments, the same conviction moments, the same throw your hands up in the air moments, the same fall on your knees in repentance moment that I had that week. If I can help them get there in 33 minutes, that's what I'm trying to do. Years ago, a conference speaker challenged us to come up with a life mission statement, which I'd never really done. So I spent a little time doing that, journaling, writing it out, trying to shrink it down, and eventually came to a sentence. My life's mission is to lead as many people as possible to a joyful and growing relationship with Christ and His church. I feel like God's called me to lead. It doesn't always come easy to me, but that's who God called me to do. I want people to enjoy life and faith and family and work and all the things God put us in this world to do. But I also want them to always be growing, always learning, always changing, never static. Relationship with Christ, obviously, I think the best life is a relationship with Christ and His church. I've always wanted to connect people, not just to faith in Christ, but also to His people, to His community. And so that's something I feel like my life is always about, and I hope will still be about, even in this next chapter.